Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Marianne Petrie. This episode of Slam the Gavel is sponsored by CPS Protect Consulting Services. A child protective services case is the one of the most frightening experience for any parent. Don't face it alone. Face it with confidence with Urgent Assist by CPS Protect. You can have access to former CPS investigators to make sure you preserve your rights and protect your family. If you're facing CPS involvement and aren't sure where to turn, their child welfare consultants can help you. Visit cpsprotect.com/subscribe and enter the coupon code Slam the Gavel for 10% off your first year of Urgent Assist. And this is available on all 50 states. I have another announcement. Bradley's mother, Narcisse Golan, passed away 4 months ago. He is autistic and needs structured routine and therapies he receives for his autism 6 days a week. However, Italy just entrusted Bradley to Italian social services. If he is ruled to go back, he will face the next 3 to 4 years in the Italian foster care system where he cannot speak or understand the language. And he'll be taken away from the only family he has ever known. Please call Governor Hochul, New York State at 518-474-8390. That's Governor Hochul at 518-474-8390 to please keep Bradley safe here in these United States. Hashtag keep Bradley safe. And I have a brand new guest on. I have attorney William Estrada on. He's a follower of Christ, husband, dad, nonprofit president, attorney, farmer, outdoorsman, retired water club coordinator, working to protect children by empowering parents across the nation and at the federal level. He is president of the Parental Rights Foundation, and he is doing that full-time since November of 2021. I welcome you, Attorney Estrada. And how did you get involved in all of this?
Marianne, it's great to be on. Thank you so much for having me on Slam the Gavel. I brought my gavel with me today, so all set. It's a great story. I got my start in this work working as an attorney at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I was there for 14 years, and one of the works that HSLDA does is representing families at the initial time of contact when the social worker comes to the door. So as you were talking about that advertisement from, I think, CPS Connect was the organization.
Protect?
CPS Protect was the organization. I did that work for many, many years at HSLDA, and I'll never forget the terror that every single family has. And it doesn't matter whether they're wealthy, whether they are below the poverty level, whether they're white, upper middle class, whether they're low income minority. Parents are terrified when a social worker comes to the door. I've talked to judges, I've talked to lawyers when a social worker is at the door, and the fear is universal because they understand that our child welfare system is broken. And oftentimes you are considered guilty until proven innocent. And these are agents of the government who have the ability to remove a child from the home. And so we were able to help many families. Then I spent several years at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Office for Civil Rights. And at that time, the Office for Civil Rights was enforcing civil rights laws, which are violating particularly minority families' rights. There were disproportional removals of minority children from minority families in numerous states. And so there were enforcement actions that Office for Civil Rights was doing. I was on the career side. So some people would call me a bureaucrat. I like to call myself a career civil servant. And then in November of 2021, I came on as the first full-time president of the Parental Rights Foundation. We're a nationwide organization, and we work at the federal, as you said, at the state, at the local level. But a lot of our work is focused on suing social workers who have violated families' due process constitutional rights, and also advancing model legislation at the state level to put more due process protections in to protect innocent children and families. One thing that's really been forgotten, which we are working to raise awareness of and educate policymakers, judges, and just the general public, is that CPS investigations are traumatic to children. And nearly all, over 3/4 of CPS investigations are unfounded, but there's still a government officer that comes in, a social worker who has the power to remove a child, the stranger who comes in, who's interviewing children. It's traumatic for children, traumatic for families. And thankfully, the science is kind of starting to show that and to prove that now.
And it seems like always that I've been hearing, there's more of these calls on false allegations, more of these than they are answering to children that are really truly suffering.
Oh, exactly. That is what's happening. And when a social worker goes in, or a state legislator or policymaker has the attitude that, oh, these are not harmful investigations. Let's just investigate everyone. And, if you're an innocent parent, you have nothing to hide, you'll be fine. They're forgetting about the trauma that this is causing to children and to families. I've talked to many families, innocent families, proven unfounded, ended up being no problem, but they went through weeks, sometimes months of that terror. Is a social worker going to show up at the door and take away my children?
Mhm.
And we are working to try and change this so that families have protections, that there's off ramps for CPS workers. They get to the door and they see that obviously this is a loving family. Maybe they've fallen on hard economic times. Maybe it was just an anonymous false report from a disgruntled neighbor. But so many times the social workers have told me, well, our state policy requires us to conduct a full investigation, a home visit, talk to the children, talk to a pediatrician, talk to other people. And it's causing two problems. It's causing that trauma to the innocent family, to the
Mhm.
child, to the parents. It's also, however, using valuable time when our overworked child welfare investigators could be helping children who are truly at risk of abuse and neglect. And so we are working on this because it's protecting innocent families, but also making sure that our limited resources from child welfare investigators can go to the people who truly are at risk of harm.
Mhm. Well, the thing also is there's a lot of uneducated, inept caseworkers out there that mishandle these cases and mishandle and terrorize these parents. These are on the level of domestic terrorists.
I don't know if I'd go that far with using domestic terrorism, but there are three types of child welfare investigators. There are the good ones.
Mhm.
Then there are the ones who are well-intentioned, but who have this attitude that I talked about, of where they think like, oh, this is no harm. I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. And let's just all get along. And they don't think about the trauma that's causing. But then there are those child welfare workers who are extremely harmful.
Mhm.
They do not respect parental rights. They do not respect the innocence of children,
Mhm.
and they come in and they trample families. They say it's our way or the highway. These are the ones who will call for law enforcement, who will say, we're going to break down your door. We're
Mhm.
going to take your children away. They don't think that they need a warrant. And those are the ones that we sue the most often. And
Mhm.
it's, Marianne, as you know, it's difficult to sue social workers. You have to first have a standing, which means that there has to be a harm, which means usually that a family has gone through tremendous trauma and
Mhm.
harm. And then even if you get all past that, you have an attorney, you have an organization. Our organization does not charge families. We're a public interest law firm that we raise funds from donors who support our work, who understand the importance of parental rights and protecting children, and protecting our due process, Fourth Amendment rights to be secure in your person's houses, places, and effects. But even if you get past all of that, then you have what's called qualified immunity. And
Mhm.
more people are discussing qualified immunity. We've seen that a lot in discussion of police brutality, where there are just egregious cases. A person who's been harmed or their family will file a lawsuit, sometimes a federal civil rights section 1983 lawsuit, sometimes a lawsuit under state law. And then the courts will say, yes, this was terrible and violated the person's civil rights and constitutional rights, but because of qualified immunity, which is this court-made doctrine that certain government workers do not have liability if they're acting in the course and scope of their official duties of their employment, and so you can't get monetary damages. And that's been the single biggest hurdle to finding accountability and finding justice to
Mhm.
innocent families. Again, it's something that we continue to challenge. We work on amicus briefs telling the courts that, no, if you are a government official who tramples someone's constitutional rights, you should pay, you should be
Mhm.
liable. And even if you don't, even if that government official isn't liable, then the government should pay out to not make it whole, but just as a way of showing that they were wrong and giving justice to these families. And it's an ongoing battle. I'm cautiously optimistic that we will prevail, but that's only one part. There's also passing state laws to reform the CPS system to kind of level the playing field for innocent families.
That needs to be done, and people are saying this isn't happening fast enough.
You know, Marianne, I get that. And I think there's a lot more work to do. We barely scratched the surface, but I want to share one success story, then want to share some information, and then want to kind of look at this realistically of how you said that not enough is being done quickly enough. First off, the success story, I really have to give credit to Montana. If we have any Montana listeners, your state legislature has really taken the lead in realizing that the playing field is not even remotely level for innocent families and children. There's an organization in Montana called the Montana Child Protection Alliance. And for many years now, they've been doing tremendous work to raise awareness of the trauma that innocent families and children go through in these unnecessary CPS investigations. And there is just a ton of legislation that's moving in Montana. One bill, HB 37, just passed it. It was overwhelmingly, I think it was 90-2. It passed the House, and then it just passed earlier this week the Montana Senate by a vote of 41-9. This bill declares, quote, that it is the policy of the state of Montana to ensure that there is no forced removal of a child from the family without first obtaining a warrant from a court unless the child is likely to experience sexual abuse or physical abuse in the time that would be required to obtain a warrant. So that's the first thing, kind of sets this as the policy of the state of Montana. It ensures that CPS in Montana shall ensure that department training and policies comply with constitutional requirements. It is very strong language protecting families where maybe a parent has a glass of wine or uses medical marijuana, but there's no other allegations of harm to children, so it protects them from having the government come in and remove their children. It protects families who might have low income or be struggling from having their children removed. It really understands that poverty is not neglect. And there are systems to protect people who have fallen on hard times. We don't need to remove their children. And then just provides a host of additional protections for due process rights of parents and families, limits child removals, requires warrants, for example. And again, if our listeners in Montana are listening, contact Governor Gianforte and ask him to sign HB 37 into law. There's a bunch of other bills that are moving in Montana. This one's the first one that's made it to the governor's desk. Some of them are model legislation to make it easier for innocent families to get off the child abuse and neglect registry. So a lot of good news is coming from Montana. Montana is leading the nation in protecting innocent families. Second bit of good news, Marianne, if I can, we've been working.
Need that.
Oh, I know, and we truly do. But there are good things happening. We've been working with a national organization called Let Grow, led by Lenore Skenazy, which is working to change neglect laws in our country to clarify that reasonable independence decisions that parents may make, like letting their 11-year-old walk home from the bus stop, 100 yards, but walk home, letting their children play outside without mom or dad standing there the whole time, just watching from the window, as they're playing in the front yard or backyard, that those sort of actions do not constitute neglect. And last year, we worked with Let Grow in Colorado. This bill, there was heavy opposition from CPS. They said, no, we need to be able to make these decisions. We don't trust parents. But it was incredible to see a left-right coalition. We had far-left organizations. We had far-right organizations. We had middle-of-the-road organizations like ours. And this bill, the Reasonable Independence for Kids bill, which clarifies that these reasonable parenting decisions are not neglect, it passed the Colorado legislature unanimously, and Governor Jared Polis of Colorado signed it into law. Then we took that victory and we took it to Virginia. We're headquartered, the Parental Rights Foundation is headquartered in Loudoun County, Virginia, about 50 miles west of Washington, D.C. And again, we worked with Let Grow. We have a long time, she's actually retiring, but a longtime state senator. Her name is Jill Vogel, who has built strong bipartisan credibility. She carried our bill. She's a longtime personal friend of mine. And again, And again, we had strong CPS opposition. We had actually the Commonwealth attorneys in Virginia say, no, we can't really trust parents. And it was great, Marianne, because in the hearing, the Commonwealth attorneys rep comes and stands up and he's like, we oppose this bill. And one of the legislators, it was the chairman of the committee, actually says, can you tell us why you oppose the bill? And I'm there sitting there watching. We had parents, we had kids who had been testifying in support of our bill. Some of them, they'd been playing in the backyard. Mom was inside the house watching through the window, washing dishes. And cops descended on this little 9-year-old and are like, why are you playing outside without permission? In Virginia, you need a parent standing right there with you. If you're 9 years old, can't even play in your backyard. And so she testified about this story, but the chairman of the committee asks the Commonwealth attorney's rep, he's like, well, why do you oppose this? And he stammers and stutters for a little bit. And then he's like, well, I don't actually know why we oppose it. It kind of seems reasonable to me, but I was told that our organization opposes it. And the wind just went out of the opposition's sails at that moment. And so the Reasonable Independence for Kids bill passed the Virginia legislature unanimously, and then Governor Glenn Youngkin signed it into law. So it will become law in Virginia. And some people might say, well, these are small fixes, but every step that we can take to make sure that less innocent, loving parents and their children go through the trauma of a CPS investigation is a win. And then, as I said, we'll talk about the not so good news. We have, again, lots of these model bills. We have model bills to get rid of anonymous reporting. Oftentimes, especially in custody disputes or neighbor disputes, you'll have someone weaponize the system and file a false report anonymously of abuse or neglect. We're trying to get rid of that and change it to confidential reporting. So if I see a child being abused and I make the phone call, I give my name, and that name is not shared with the potential abuser, but the state child welfare system still has it on file. If they can see, like, okay, this is clearly a false and defamatory report, then they can send that over to the prosecuting attorney. So that's some model legislation we have. We talked about central registry due process to make sure that people are not put on a central registry unless they're convicted of child abuse or neglect. We have another bill that we call CPS investigation reforms, which is a model bill to just require warrants, to require court orders. And it's an uphill battle, Marian. I won't sugarcoat it, but we're seeing victories on a state by state level. And if we have listeners who are interested in helping in their state, you can contact us at parentalrightsfoundation.org, and we'd love to work with them and with you to get more of these model bills introduced all across the country.
This needs to be done. People need to come forward and help with this, and also come out and tell their stories of how they were and their families were abused by these caseworkers that are power hungry.
The telling of the stories is so important, Marianne. In a couple of years ago, we submitted an amicus brief to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. So as our listeners know, there's federal district courts, the lowest level of federal courts. Then there are the Court of Appeals. These are the powerful courts right before the Supreme Court. And then, of course, there's the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the court that can decide whether or not to grant cert review in a case. So oftentimes they don't. So the circuit courts really, in many instances, are the last resort for many parents. And we had a case that was called Doe versus Woodard. It was a case in which a 3-year-old girl was strip searched by a child welfare investigator at her preschool without her parents' knowledge or consent. The mother was not suspected of abuse. The suspicions were proven to be unfounded. The mother never knew that there was an investigation, that her daughter had been interviewed by the social worker, until one day she was talking with her daughter. And a little 3-year-old girl says, I hope that this lady doesn't come to my school again because I don't like it when she takes off my clothes. And the mom, I mean, think of it. If you're this mom, like, whoa, stop the presses. What did you just say? And our brief that we filed with the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, it's called an amicus brief, Latin for friend of the court, focused on one issue only, and that was child abuse investigations, child neglect investigations. They create trauma to families and to children. Now, sometimes, if there's sex abuse going on, or physical abuse, or major neglect, like maybe the parents strung out on fentanyl and the children are in horrific living conditions, the trauma of having a stranger and law enforcement and removals take place is to put it in legal terms, a compelling state interest from the government and the least restrictive means to protect the child's health and welfare. But when it's a false report, when it's unfounded, when there's no evidence of it, when it's just like, oh, well, this is a parent with a disability or a low income parent, and instead of providing support, the government comes in and starts doing home searches and investigations. That is the trauma on children and families that is not a compelling governmental interest, is not the least restrictive means, and it's very, very harmful. And so our amicus brief in the Doe versus Woodard case, and you can find it at parentalrightsfoundation.org. You can read it. We encourage policymakers to look at it. We've shared it with other legislators, is that courts and policymakers and the government needs to understand the harm that this is causing. We cite scientific studies, we cite law review articles, and the good news, Marianne, is this is becoming an issue that more and more people are sitting up and taking notice of. The New York State Assembly and the New York State Senate recently conducted a hearing on whether mandatory reporting laws are causing more harm than help. And we submitted our amicus brief. We submitted other information to them. The Minnesota legislature is doing the same thing of asking for testimony on whether mandatory reporting laws requiring everyone under penalty of prosecution to report anything, even if they don't really think it's abuse or neglect. But if that sort of, you see something, say something when it comes to children, that's actually causing more harm than help. It's flooding the system with false claims. Children who are truly at risk of abuse and neglect are falling through the cracks, and it's causing trauma to innocent children and families.
Oh, I agree. But what do you do with these, we'll say, vengeful parents that will call in false accusations almost like 22? I heard of one guy that had, like, I think it was 45 times he was called in on. And I mean, I had 2 back-to-back ones within 4 days of each other, and they even had that documented wrong. But what do you do with these people? And they come into your house, they essentially light a fire in your living room and then leave.
So there's 3 things parents can do in that. The first one is talk to an attorney, contact our organization. Almost all 50 states, it's about 44, so there's about 6 that don't have penalties for false reporting as part of their child welfare codes, and usually as part of their either mandatory reporting or state laws setting up a report system. There's also a penalty for false reporting. And so contact our organization, contact an attorney. If you're represented by an attorney, ask them for help. And there are ways that you can send a letter, an attorney can send a letter to the Child Welfare Service saying, keep this report on file. We believe this is a false report. Here's who we think is making it. We want you to file a complaint or to investigate it. So that's the first thing you can do. The bad news is most of the child welfare agencies are like, oh, yeah, we know this is unfounded. Yeah, well, this is a false report. Yeah, this is the person who keeps calling. But, we're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to move it off into the file, and this file grows up. And again, it's because they don't understand the trauma that these false reports are causing to innocent children and families. And they also don't really, instead of saying this is burying our system under false reports, they just say, well, give us more money so we can hire more social workers to do more investigations. It's not a good system. And so we're trying to tell policymakers, you got to fix the system. Stop just throwing money at it, fix it so we're not weaponizing the system, encouraging false reports. That's the first thing. Second thing is, we have the model legislation to fix this. Our confidential reporting versus anonymous reporting is a very good bill. It protects, the anonymity of a caller. It's not like, oh yeah, your teacher filed a report. It's, we can't tell you who filed the report, but we have the information. And that's critical in making sure that we can go after, that the government can go after people who are making false reports. So that's the second part of this. And unfortunately, not a single state has adopted our confidential versus anonymous reporting model legislation. It's come close in many states, but we've just had a very CPS fights tooth and nail. The CPS system fights tooth and nail to stop this. And so the way we're going to win is if more parents, Marianne, like those listening to this podcast, contact their state legislators. They go to parentalrightsfoundation.org, send their legislator the link to our model bill. It's a short model bill. It's got the research backed up on it with like our amicus brief and other research talking about how these false reports are bad for the system, bad for children truly at risk of abuse and neglect, and bad for innocent families. And we really have to educate policymakers on that, because that's ultimately how we're going to do this. The final part is the hardest part. But that is, if a family has the resources, and our organization does not do this, we only go after the government, we don't go after individuals. But if an individual has the resources, you should talk to an attorney about filing a lawsuit or a complaint or an order of protection against the person, because usually 95% of the time, parents know who are making these repeated anonymous reports. Again, they're usually in the context of a divorce, of a custody battle, the weaponization of the system, but often they're also a disgruntled relative. I've seen so many, sadly, that the reports come in the Monday after Thanksgiving. They had a fight at the Thanksgiving table. Friday, the offices are generally closed. Saturday, they're stewing on it. Sunday, they're stewing on it. And Monday, when the office opens, they file a report. And of course, as you know, many of these states also, it's 24/7 the hotline. So they'll just pick up the phone driving home from the Thanksgiving dinner, and they'll file this false complaint. And then the social worker shows up. And so oftentimes parents know who's doing this, a disgruntled neighbor, disgruntled relative, and it's very harmful. And it's, I think, just the lowest of the low if a spouse in a divorce, or a neighbor, or a relative files a false report. It's, again, harmful to those children, but it's harmful to children truly at risk of abuse and neglect. And so if we have a listener who's kind of jaded and who's like, yeah, you just don't care about this, I like making reports, even if I know they're false, you're harming children truly at risk of abuse and neglect. So do not do that.
But they still do, and it just doesn't stop. It's just not stopping. I think, how about, instead of throwing money at the system, somehow clean it out of the caseworkers that are not educated enough to be around people.
Oh, that would be ideal, Marianne. Most of them, however, are career government employees. And depending on the state, there might be union rules, so they can't be fired. And that's the problem that we see of some states they can be fired. But in many states, the bad actors are protected from liability under qualified immunity. They're protected from being terminated, even if they're supervisors, and even if the CPS agency knows they're not a good worker. So we're not focused on firing people. I mean, that's a state law policy. That's pretty difficult when you talk about government employees. We're focused on just trying to pass the laws, educating the policymakers, because we can do that. We can win those battles, but we need parents to get involved. And one thing we see often is, Marianne, parents who've gone through this, they get it and they're passionate about it. But so often I talk to parents who say, well, I'm a loving parent, this would never happen to me. It's those other parents who get the CPS investigations and the trauma. And unfortunately, we live in such a day and age that the odds are against you. You know, that line from that movie, Katniss Everdeen. Maybe Hunger Games. May the odds ever be in your favor. The odds are against you, because at some point, especially at the way we're going of more and more mandatory reporters, someone's not going to like you. And the odds are against you, particularly if you're a minority family, if you're a lower income family, the odds are even more likely that you're going to have a CPS investigation come against you. But even, I talked to, unfortunately, white upper middle class families who are like, oh, this is not a problem we'll ever have to face. This is a problem and a solution in search of a problem. And I'm like, no, this is a justice issue. This is a fairness issue. This is a due process legal issue. And, oh, by the way, you may one day be at the receiving end of this. And so we're trying to just educate parents of, we got to stand together on this with the system. And if legislators hear from enough people, they will take action. We're seeing that start to change of policymakers realizing the status quo is ripping families apart, and that it needs to change.
Mhm. And these parents that will say, it's not going to happen to me because I have money or I've got a good career. They're going after everybody and they don't realize this. And again, until it happens to them. And
Correct.
so, they have, they can call CPS Protect, they can call your organization, and they usually call your organization when at the point they're ready to sue.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a great way. What happens if your rights have been violated? So first, that's why organizations like CPS Protect are so important, because they'll help you at the initial time of contact. If you're a homeschooling family and you're a member of HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, they will also help you if it's related to homeschooling at the initial time of contact, and they'll provide general information or refer you to an attorney if it's not homeschool related, but at the initial time of contact. So there are organizations out there that will help you in the unlikely event that you have a CPS investigation or come against you. But again, as we've been saying, you can't tell. It could be one grouchy person who doesn't like how you're raising your children or letting them at the grocery store or walking home from the school bus stop, or what you say over Thanksgiving dinner, and that could just upend your family overnight. But then
Mhm.
our organization, we as a public interest law firm, we don't charge anyone. We're our funding all comes from donors. We're pretty picky on the cases that we take. But let me walk you through what would be a sort of case that we would consider. It's one where obviously there's been a CPS investigation. It's one where it's turned out to be unfounded, but it's one where the family went through the trauma and harm of an investigation. And Marion, it's so hard. I desperately wish we could protect 100% of innocent families from even going through these investigations, where the social worker shows up and just at the front door is like, this is ridiculous, and I'm closing. And I've talked to families where that has happened. Sometimes the system does work. And again, that's why I never blanket say all social workers are bad, because I've talked to social workers who get it, that they are agents of the government, that the Constitution applies to them. They truly are there just to protect the children who are at risk of abuse and neglect, and they respect parental rights. The problem is that those are not the majority of social workers, at least of the ones that we've interacted with. And our system of laws and regulations really is stacked against parents. So even the good social workers are struggling against a system that acts as if everyone is guilty until proven innocent when a report comes in, which of course is flipping on its head our constitutional system. So those are kind of the threshold things that we look for. Then the secondary issues that we look at are either social workers not following their own policy or acting in a way that they know that it's a false report, that it's unfounded, but they're still there violating the family's rights. And so those are some of the key things we look at. I think it's important also to think of, because we'll probably have some parents here who are like, this is terrifying. I
It
didn't
is.
know this sort of thing. Maybe some do, but maybe some don't. And so I want to talk to those parents so you're not, living in fear. There are things you can do to, as much as possible, protect yourself from a false CPS report upending your life. The first one is have a very good relationship with a pediatrician. I talk to parents who are like, our kids are healthy. We don't need to see a doctor. We'll just go to urgent care if they have a bad sinus infection and need antibiotics. And at the Parental Rights Foundation, we have several doctors, retired pediatricians who are on our board. You can go to our podcast at theparentalrightsfoundation.org and listen to some of these recent interviews. And as a lawyer, as our pediatrician, board members will always tell you, having a relationship with a pediatrician that you trust as a parent is critical. And in this day and age, we see lots of doctors who no longer respect parental rights. And so it may be difficult to find a pediatrician who you respect, who you have a good relationship with, but put in the time to find someone. Ask around. You might have to do a little bit of traveling a little further, so you might still use urgent care just for childhood immunizations or every now and then, but still have a relationship with a pediatrician that you trust. Because if a false report comes in, oftentimes if you can head it off at the pass. If a parent says, we actually just had our child well visit, our doctor saw our kids, here's our doctor's phone number, I give you consent for you to talk to your doctor. You wouldn't want to do that if you don't trust your doctor. You certainly wouldn't be able to do that if you don't have a doctor, like if you just have an urgent care. And so that's probably the first most important thing that you can do. The second thing is, and again, this is not giving legal advice, this is general information. So always talk to a lawyer if you're going through a CPS investigation. But another kind of good thing to do is, if a social worker shows up at your front door, have your kids come over to the door, without Fourth Amendment, any violation of without them coming in. Your kids can come on the front porch and chat with the social worker, say, hi, yeah, here's our names, here's our ages. No, we like our mom. Please don't take us away, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But, it de-escalates. The social worker gets to see the children, that they're happy, healthy. Maybe they're dirty because they've been playing outside, but they are not what a social worker would think of as abused or neglected children. So those are kind of two just practical steps that families can do, which in 90% of the time, sometimes 95% of the time, I've seen work very, very well to head off at the pass, kind of things spiraling into a situation where parental rights are violated, where the sanctity of the home is violated, and where there's trauma to the children and families.
And a lot of parents, they'll get a call from CPS saying, oh, I want to come over and talk to you at such an hour. And you think, and you're told by other people, oh, just let them in. Your house is great. Don't worry about it. Just, let the caseworker in and talk to you. It'll be all right. Sometimes it's not all right. And they come in and hand you a piece of paper to sign, like it's a blank piece of paper with your name underneath, and you're so traumatized already that they're barreling into your house with a very angry affect, and they're already raising their voice. You just sign the paper stupidly because you're so traumatized already when that happens right out the gate, because you're caught off guard.
That's a really good point, Marianne. And I will say that it depends. Sometimes it is better to let a social worker into your house. Oftentimes it's not. This is very case dependent. And I don't want to say a blanket here on the podcast, on the radio, of what parents should do. That is something that, talk to your lawyer. Again, if you're using CPS Protect or another organization, talk to qualified legal advice in your state on what you should do, because some state laws are different. Some state laws, it's pretty stacked against you, and depending on the allegations, particularly if it's sexual abuse allegations or significant physical abuse, if you don't work with the social worker, they probably will have probable cause to get a court order, and then you lose complete control over the whole system. So it's very case dependent, and get qualified legal advice on what a family should do in that situation. I will say, though, and you bring a good point there, be very careful about signing papers. I've seen families, like you say, Marianne, the fear, the adrenaline going through you, the am I going to lose my kids, the what is happening here, will sometimes cause people to not look at what they're being asked to sign. And sometimes it's just this is just a form of, I've given you your rights as someone who's been accused, and you acknowledge them. But sometimes social workers will slide a safety plan there in front of a family, and the safety plan is a legal document that will have the family really on the road of government supervision. And sometimes, again, this is the legal advice. Again, sometimes, depending on the allegations, it might be in a family's interests to sign a safety plan, or at least talk to their lawyer and have some things changed in it. But sometimes it's not. And because it's a legal document, you are within your rights to tell the social worker, thank you. I'm going to be meeting with a lawyer first thing in the morning or later on this afternoon. I'd like to hold off on signing this. I need to have my lawyer review it.
Mhm.
And you have that right to do that. Again, talk to your lawyer about that, but pay attention to what you're signing as a parent.
Oh, definitely. Also, it seems like, and I'm hearing this from other parents, is a caseworker, because I don't know if they're licensed social workers or not. The ones I was dealing with were just caseworkers. But they'll call you up and they'll immediately start yelling at you on the phone. And I've heard this from other parents. And when this happened to me for the second time, I told her, I said, "Don't talk to me in that manner, and I will be calling my lawyer." And I hung up on her. Then a week later, she calls back in a pleasant demeanor to tell me I was indicated for emotional child abuse. Where do they get off doing all this stuff?
So I've not had a lot of instances of caseworkers starting off the investigation yelling at parents.
Mhm.
That sounds like you unfortunately, Marianne, got the bad caseworker
Yeah.
right off the gate. Generally, I've found that caseworkers, even those who don't really respect parents, still are going to be cordial. And I encourage people, again, it's scary, it's terrifying, but there's that verse in the Jewish and Christian scriptures of a soft answer turns away wrath.
Mhm. Mhm.
And even with the fear and the anger and I've got my rights and the Constitution and I should be considered innocent until proven guilty, that soft answer really does go a long way. And so when I talk to people, I remind them, you don't, even if the caseworker is yelling, you don't yell.
Mhm.
Even if the caseworker is being abusive, you don't be abusive back to the caseworker. This is one of those instances that, for whatever reason, you are going through an investigation unjustly, but you still have rights, but it is your children we're talking about. And so just it's in everyone's best interest to come and approach it from a very reasonable way. And the more the caseworker acts unreasonable and you as a parent act reasonable, the more it will help your case, even if unfortunately there has to be a civil rights lawsuit filed at the end.
Mhm.
It's
Oh,
a strategic legal battle, and it's
mhm.
not easy. Some of us are more more passionate on these issues than
Mhm.
others, and some people it's harder to take that step back and just say, I'm going to even if everyone around me is kind of losing their head, I'm not going to lose my head. And so some of us, our personalities might be harder to do that, but it's critically important. So if our listeners and our viewers take nothing away from this, it's make sure that you are acting reasonably, no matter if law enforcement isn't or social workers aren't, because in the long run and in the short run,
Mm.
it will help you protect your children and protect your rights as a person.
And parents are also videotaping everything when they
So that's another one. I'm cautious about the videotaping. Again, that is something I'm not going to say because different states have different laws, and sometimes the social worker knocks on your door and you show up with the phone and you're recording. It can immediately escalate a situation that doesn't need to be escalated. In
Mhm.
addition, some states have different laws about videotaping. If there's law enforcement, there can be a different law. And so that's going to be very fact sensitive. In general, I find that videotaping right at the beginning is not in a family's best interest. It escalates a situation too far, especially at the initial time of contact. Now, if someone's already been through the ringer,
Yeah.
maybe it's different, but I would strongly recommend before you start videotaping, get competent legal advice in your state, because
Mhm.
states have a patchwork of laws. Again, if law enforcement's there, it could be a different law than if it's just a social worker. So be careful. One thing I can certainly say is
Mhm.
don't post to social media
No, you're
if
right.
there is a recording. Be very careful what you put on social media. It's one of those things we've all seen the cop shows of the police officers saying, your Fourth Amendment rights, anything you say can and will be used against you. And that is definitely the truth. Social media, nothing is it's there forever.
Mhm.
And it could be taken out of context to make you look very badly and by a court in an affidavit from a social worker. So even if our listeners are not listening to me of recording, and I hope that they're listening and they'll get competent legal advice in their state before they start doing something, do not, whatever you do, put anything on social media. Don't put, I'm so angry, I'm shaking, social workers were at my door. Wait to win, to get that unfounded letter, then talk to a lawyer before you put things on social media. And I know for some people, we're in the digital age. Everyone's on social media. Probably you shouldn't. I was at a continuing legal education meeting once, and this old crusty lawyer gets up and he's like, I'm convinced that social media killed the dinosaurs and it's going to kill us. And I still remember that every time I think of social media or talk with people. So be very careful what you put on social media about your children.
Mhm. Now, a lot of parents don't know that when they are, we'll say, indicated of whatever, they have to go before an administrative judge to be adjudicated and taken off the registry. I don't know if that is for all states.
Let me tell you about Oklahoma, Marianne. In
Mhm.
Oklahoma, if you are found, if there's a finding, either some states it's indicated of abuse or neglect, some states it's finding of abuse or neglect. There's different terminology in all 50 states, but in Oklahoma, you have a 30-day window to file an appeal. It's only a written appeal. It's only to the CPS agency, so it's not before an independent third party or an administrative judge. And then you don't even have a right to file a lawsuit if the agency refuses to take you off. So Oklahoma is certainly out of the mainstream, but it's pretty difficult to get off those registries if there's a finding made against a family. And so that's why we have our model legislation. You can see it at parentalrightsfoundation.org under our model bills. But it's called Central Registry Due Process, and it gives families rights both before they're added to that central registry and easier to take their names off if it's a false or an incorrect finding of abuse or neglect. Because let's talk about these impacts. If you work with children, if you're a teacher, if you are in ministry, that could be the end of your employment. And there's a body of case law where people have filed these lawsuits because they didn't have the ability to have notice and hearing. There wasn't due process. And then they were found to have, there was a finding made against them. The evidentiary standards are much lower in these CPS issues than if it goes before a court. And it's very difficult to get your good name cleared. So we are working on that. Again, oftentimes families have to hire an attorney at great expense to themselves to walk them through it. If we've got listeners, Marianne, who've been through this and there was a finding of abuse or neglect and it was unjust and there's no evidence backing it up, I would love to talk with them, because I and our organization, we're looking for cases of innocent families unjustly put on central registries and they cannot remove themselves. And there's organizations in Pennsylvania. There's an organization called Community Legal Services of Philadelphia that is actually, they're representing a parent who was put on a central registry, and it's just complete, star chamber rules almost of getting your name off. Then Goldwater Institute in Arizona is representing a family, a mom who was put on a central registry, again, falsely and unjustly, and she couldn't get her name off. So we are tied in with a network of legal organizations around the country who are filing these lawsuits. We're looking to file a lawsuit too. Again, there has to be it has to be the right case. It has to be there has to be standing where the person suffered harm for being on the central registry. There has to be good evidence that they should not have been put on it. But would love to talk to any listeners. You can find our contact information at parentalrightsfoundation.org. But would love to talk to anyone who's been recently put on a central registry. If it happened 4 or 5 years ago, probably the statute of limitations has told. But if this recently happened, or if you know someone where this happened, we would love to talk with you.
So the statutes, if something happened and it's what, 2 years in every state?
It depends. It's some states are less, some states are more. Some states there's certain rules where you can sometimes get past the statute of limitations. So it's going to really be very case specific and very state specific in particular.
Okay, so if that's all like if a parent or the child had been truly harmed, that would, that would stop
Well, in a
that.
central registry, it's going to be the parent or caregiver. The child
Right,
would be the
right,
victim, so they're not going to be on the central
right,
registry.
right.
So it just would be the child or the parent or caregiver.
But if they were either of them were harmed in either way, wouldn't that, I want to say, vitiate the statutes of limitation?
So the harm from a parent or caregiver being placed on the central registry would be loss of employment. It's generally not enough to say, well, I've harmed just because my name is there. There generally has to be you lost a job, or you couldn't adopt, or you couldn't be a foster care parent,
Mhm.
or something like that. But it depends. In general, you know, if the statute of limitations has run, the statute of limitations has run. So it's going to be very state specific.
Okay. Well, I'm so glad we had this conversation. And
I am too.
is there anything else you would like to add? Any other advice?
Be proactive.
Mhm.
We are in, and when I say we, I mean, freedom loving parents and our allies are in a battle against the state that more and more doesn't respect parental rights. We see this in the public schools. We see this in the medical community. We see this particularly when it comes to child welfare investigations. And don't wait until it happens to you. Get
Mhm.
involved in the system. You may say, well, Will, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. You're a taxpayer. You're a citizen. You are a parent. You're a grandparent. You love the children around you. And so take the time to reach out to your state legislator. You can find that information. You can just Google, who is my state legislator? Again, this is not going to be in Washington, D.C. This is going to be closer to you at your state legislation level. And they're very receptive to you. They're in most states just ordinary people. It's kind of a side job. They're working as a state legislator. Go to our webpage, parentalrightsfoundation.org. You can sign up for our emails. We're having more and more just online lobby training where we walk you through of, I've never even called my elected official, and we provide you the resources and the training to give you that confidence to go in and do it, because these battles are so critical. And if we don't change the laws, Marianne, we're going to continue to lose. We're going to continue to lose in court. We're going to continue to lose when a social worker who doesn't respect parental rights and the Constitution shows up at the front door. And it's going to be bad for our children. It's going to be bad for our grandchildren. It's going to be
Oh,
harmful to our civil rights as Americans and as citizens. It's going to be harmful to the Constitution. And so I just urge the listeners here on this show, find out how you can get involved. Doesn't matter if you don't feel like you're the most effective communicator. You love your children, you love your grandchildren, and you can make a difference.
mhm. Yeah, that's excellent. And I'd like to have you back on again.
I would love to be back on, Marianne.
Oh,
Let's make
yeah.
this regular.
Yes, most definitely. And I totally appreciate you coming on. So, don't jump off. Slam the Gavel's a podcast, help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms. I am your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth, and future book coming out, Raised by These Wolves. Please join us again in the future with Attorney Estrada and other exciting episodes as well. Thank you, Attorney Estrada.
You are welcome, Marianne. Thank you for what you're doing, and it was a privilege to be on with you today.
Oh, it was a privilege for me too. Thank you.